There's a plant growing along your fence line right now that soldiers once stuffed into their boots to stop blisters and bleeding at the same time. Most people spray it, mow it, or yank it out the second it shows up without ever knowing what they're actually getting rid of. Stick around because one entry on this list was roasted and brewed as a coffee substitute during wartime rationing. And it's still sold in stores today by people who have no idea it's growing free in their own backyard. And near the end, we'll get to a plant so aggressive that farmers have spent centuries trying to wipe it out, never realizing it was quietly feeding and healing people the entire time. These aren't rare herbs from a specialty garden center. They're growing in cracks in your driveway right now. Let's get into it. Number 12, Henbit Deadnettle. Small, fuzzy, purple-hooded flowers stacked around a square stem, usually one of the very first things to bloom when the ground starts to warm up. Most people see it carpeting a lawn in late winter and figure it's just another weed to mow down before the grass wakes up. Here's what they're missing. Henbit is a member of the mint family, and like most of its relatives, the entire above-ground plant is edible. The leaves and stems have a mild, slightly sweet, faintly peppery flavor, closer to spinach than to mint. Foragers toss it raw into salads, blend it into smoothies, or saute it the way you'd cook any leafy green. Because henbit flowers so early, often weeks before dandelions even think about opening, it functions as one of the very first food sources available to bees coming out of winter, with almost nothing else blooming yet. That timing matters more than people realize. A late frost or a slow spring can wipe out a hive that has no early nectar source, and henbit fills exactly that gap. Traditional folk use also included brewing the leaves into a mild tea, taken to encourage sweating during a cold or mild fever, similar to how yarrow was used. The plant spreads fast through both seed and creeping stems that root wherever they touch soil, which is exactly why it seems to appear overnight in bare patches and disturbed soil. Before mowing over a lawn full of henbit next spring, consider that you might be cutting down the only thing keeping local bees alive until better forage shows up. Number 11, Cleavers. Also called goosegrass or stickyweed, this one announces itself before you even see it. Thin, sticky stems covered in tiny hooked hairs that cling to clothing, fur, and skin the moment you brush past. Most people treat it as an annoying, clingy nuisance and pull it out the second it grabs onto a pant leg. That reputation hides a plant with a genuinely long medicinal history. Cleavers has been used for centuries as a lymphatic support herb, traditionally taken as a tea or tincture to encourage lymphatic drainage and reduce mild swelling, particularly around lymph nodes. Herbalists have also used it topically, crushed into a poultice for minor skin irritation, insect bites, and small wounds, similar in application to plantain or self-heal. The young shoots, picked before the hooked hairs toughen up, are edible and have been cooked as a spring green in parts of Europe for generations. Usually boiled briefly to soften the texture before it's eaten. There's also a stranger use hiding in this plant. The small round seeds, when roasted and ground, have been used historically as a caffeine-free coffee substitute, since Cleavers belongs to the same plant family as the actual coffee plant. That clinginess that makes Cleavers so irritating on a walk through overgrown grass is the exact same mechanism the plant uses to spread its seeds, hitching a ride on any animal or person who brushes past. It's not trying to bother you, it's just doing what it's always done. Number 10, ground ivy. Sometimes called creeping Charlie, this one spreads low and fast across shaded lawns, sending out long trailing stems that root at every node they touch. Homeowners fighting a losing battle against it in shady grass rarely know what they're actually dealing with. Ground ivy is a member of the mint family, and before hops became the standard bittering agent in beer, ground ivy was one of the primary herbs used to flavor and preserve ale across medieval Europe. It was so central to brewing that it earned old folk names directly tied to that use, and entire households once grew it specifically for that purpose. Medicinally, ground ivy has a long traditional reputation as a remedy for congestion and mild respiratory irritation, typically brewed into a tea and taken warm. It was also used topically, crushed fresh and applied to minor cuts and bruises the same way yarrow or plantain would be. The leaves have a sharp, slightly bitter, minty aroma when crushed, and while it's edible in small amounts, it's typically used more for tea and flavoring than as a standalone leafy green because of that strong bitterness. Ground ivy thrives specifically in the shaded, damp, poorly draining spots where grass struggles most, which is exactly why it shows up first in the parts of a lawn that are already unhealthy. Rather than treating it as the problem, it's worth noticing that ground ivy is often just the first plant willing to grow somewhere the lawn itself was already failing. Number 9. Shepherd's purse. Small white flowers on a thin stalk, followed by distinctive flat heart-shaped seed pods that give the plant its name because they resemble tiny purses. Most people never notice it until the seed pods show up, and by then it's usually already being pulled and tossed. That's unfortunate, because shepherd's purse has one of the more specific traditional uses of any plant on this list. For centuries, it was used as an herbal remedy to help slow minor bleeding, both taken internally as a tea and applied externally to cuts. And that reputation has persisted long enough that some modern herbal practitioners still recommend it for the same purpose today. The entire plant is edible, with a flavor often compared to a milder, slightly peppery version of cabbage or broccoli. Which makes sense given that shepherd's purse belongs to the same plant family as those vegetables. Young leaves work raw in salads, while the seed pods themselves have a distinct peppery bite that's been used as a seasoning in some traditional cuisines. Shepherd's purse is also nutritionally dense, particularly rich in vitamin C and calcium. And it was historically eaten as one of the reliable wild greens available across most of the growing season, since it tolerates a wide range of soil conditions and keeps producing new growth even after being cut back. It's one of the few plants on this list that thrives specifically because it gets mowed, since cutting it back only encourages it to branch out and produce more of those distinctive seed pods. Number 8. Chicory. Tall, wiry stems topped with distinctive sky blue flowers that only open in the morning and close by early afternoon. Chicory shows up along roadsides, driveway edges, and neglected corners of a yard. And most people assume it's simply an ornamental wildflower with no practical use. That assumption is where the coffee substitute comes in. Chicory root has been roasted, ground, and brewed as a coffee substitute for centuries, gaining massive popularity during periods of coffee shortage and rationing, particularly across parts of Europe and later in the American South. It's still sold commercially today, blended with actual coffee or used entirely on its own. And most people buying it in stores have no idea the plant is growing wild a few feet from their own driveway. Beyond the root, chicory leaves are edible too, closely related to endive and radicchio, which are simply cultivated varieties of the same plant. Young leaves work in salads with a slightly bitter, chicory-forward flavor, while older leaves are better cooked down to mellow that bitterness. The root also contains inulin, a type of soluble fiber that acts as a prebiotic feeding beneficial bacteria in the gut, which is part of why chicory root extract shows up in many modern fiber supplements sold at a markup for something growing free along the road. Chicory has a deep taproot similar to dandelion, which means it tolerates drought exceptionally well and continues blooming through the hottest, driest stretches of summer when most other flowering plants have already given up. That distinctive blue color so rare in wildflowers is exactly why it's worth a second look before it gets mowed down as just another roadside weed. Number 7. Burdock. Large, coarse, heart-shaped leaves and round burrs covered in hooked spines that cling relentlessly to clothing and fur. Burdock has a reputation as one of the more aggressive, unwelcome plants a yard can grow, and most people treat it accordingly, digging it out the moment it's identified. Underneath that reputation is a root vegetable that's been cultivated and eaten intentionally for centuries in parts of Asia, where it's known as gobo and sold in markets as a legitimate food crop rather than pulled as a weed. Burdock root has a mild, slightly sweet, earthy flavor, and it's traditionally sliced thin and sautéed, simmered in soups or pickled, similar to how you'd prepare a carrot or parsnip. Traditional herbal medicine has used burdock root for generations as a blood-purifying tonic and a support for skin conditions, often taken as a tea or tincture. And modern research has continued examining burdock extract for its antioxidant content. The leaves are edible too, though considerably more bitter, and are typically boiled and the water discarded once or twice to mellow that bitterness before eating. Those notorious burrs that make burdock so unwelcome in a yard are actually the direct inspiration behind Velcro. After an engineer examined how thoroughly they clung to his dog's fur and clothing, and decided to replicate the mechanism artificially. So the next time a burdock burr gets stuck in a sock or a sleeve, that's the same design sitting in half the jackets and shoes in your closet. Number 6. Mugwort. Tall, silvery green, deeply lobed leaves with a distinctive sage-like aroma when crushed, Mugwort spreads aggressively along fence lines, ditches, and neglected garden edges. And most people pull it simply because it grows fast and takes up space. That aggressive growth is hiding one of the longer medicinal histories of any plant on this list. Mugwort has been used across European and separately across Asian herbal traditions for centuries, most commonly as a tea taken to support digestion and ease mild menstrual discomfort. And in traditional Chinese medicine, dried mugwort is burned directly on or near the skin in a practice called moxibustion, used to apply gentle, penetrating heat to specific points on the body. The leaves have also been used as a natural insect repellent, historically dried and hung indoors or burned to discourage moths and other pests. A practice that predates modern chemical repellents by a very long margin. It's worth being upfront about one thing here. Mugwort is related to ragweed, and people with existing pollen allergies, particularly to ragweed, may find that mugwort triggers a similar reaction. So moderation and awareness matter here the same way they do with any potent herb. Mugwort's aggressive spread comes from an extensive underground rhizome network, the same trait that makes it nearly impossible to fully remove once established in a garden bed. That persistence has frustrated gardeners for generations. But it's the exact same trait that's kept the plant in continuous use across multiple cultures for thousands of years, without ever needing to be replanted. Number 5. Wild garlic and wild onion. Thin, grass-like leaves poking up through lawns in early spring. Easy to overlook until you catch that unmistakable onion smell after mowing over a patch of it. Most homeowners consider it a stubborn lawn nuisance that returns every single year, no matter how many times it gets pulled or sprayed. What they're actually looking at is a genuinely edible, flavorful plant that most people are paying for at a grocery store in a slightly different form. Every part of wild garlic and wild onion is edible: the slender green stalks, the small underground bulbs, and even the flower clusters that some varieties produce. The flavor is milder than cultivated garlic but unmistakably in the same family, and it works exactly the way you'd use chives or scallions, chopped fresh into eggs, folded into soft cheese, or scattered over a finished dish for a sharp, fresh bite. Traditional folk medicine also used wild garlic and onion the same way cultivated garlic has been used for centuries, as a mild antimicrobial food. Eaten regularly to support general health long before germ theory gave anyone a scientific explanation for why it seemed to work. The reason this plant returns every year despite constant pulling and mowing comes down to the underground bulbs, which regenerate readily even when the visible top growth is repeatedly cut away. Meaning the plant homeowners are fighting is essentially a perennial herb garden that nobody planted on purpose. Next time that onion smell drifts up after mowing, that's free chives growing in the lawn, not a problem that needs solving. And if you've made it this far, take a second to hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep making videos like this one, and there's plenty more still coming. Number 4. Prickly lettuce. Tall, pale green, with jagged leaves that alternate in a distinctive vertical arrangement along the stem. Prickly lettuce is often mistaken for a random weed crowding the edge of a garden bed. And most people never realize what its name is actually telling them. Prickly lettuce is a direct wild ancestor of cultivated lettuce, and if you break open a stem, you'll find a milky white sap that's the exact same compound family responsible for lettuce's mild sedative reputation. Historically dried and used in small amounts as a gentle sleep aid and mild pain reliever long before modern medicine offered other options. That sap earned the plant an old nickname referencing opium, not because it contains anything close to that strength, but because the mild calming effect was noticeable enough that people made the comparison anyway. The young leaves, picked before the plant matures and the sap becomes noticeably bitter, are edible and can be added to salads in moderation, tasting close to a more bitter version of the lettuce sold in stores today. As the plant matures, that bitterness intensifies substantially, which is why foragers typically only harvest it early in the season. Prickly lettuce also has a distinctive habit of orienting its leaves vertically, north to south, to reduce direct sun exposure during the hottest part of the day. An adaptation that's earned it the nickname compass plant in some regions, since travelers historically used that orientation for rough direction finding. Every bag of lettuce sitting in a refrigerator right now traces back to a wild plant that looks almost exactly like the one growing along that garden bed, just heavily selected over generations to remove the bitterness this one still carries. Number 3. Garlic mustard. Heart-shaped, scallop-edged leaves low to the ground in its first year, followed by taller stalks and small white flowers in its second. Garlic mustard has earned a serious reputation among conservationists as one of the most aggressive invasive species in North American forests, capable of taking over an entire forest floor and crowding out native plants within a few growing seasons. That reputation is entirely accurate, and it's also exactly why this plant deserves to be harvested rather than simply sprayed and left to rot. Every part of garlic mustard is edible, and the name describes the flavor with unusual precision, a distinct garlic aroma layered over a peppery, mustard-like bite. The leaves work raw in salads, blended into pesto in place of basil, or sautéed as a leafy green. While the small white flowers can be scattered over a finished dish, the same way you'd use edible flower garnishes. The plant is also nutritionally dense, particularly high in vitamins A and C, and foraging groups across affected regions have specifically organized garlic mustard harvesting events, treating removal as both an ecological service and a genuinely useful source of free, flavorful greens. Garlic mustard releases chemical compounds into the surrounding soil that suppress the growth of native tree seedlings and disrupt beneficial fungal networks those seedlings depend on, which is the actual mechanism behind its aggressive spread through forested areas. This is one of the rare entries on this list where pulling it isn't just acceptable, it's actively recommended. And eating what you pull is simply the most productive way to deal with a plant that would otherwise end up in a yard waste bag anyway. Number 2. Queen Anne's lace. Delicate, lacy clusters of tiny white flowers atop a tall, hairy stem, often with a single dark purple floret sitting at the exact center of the flower cluster. Queen Anne's lace is frequently left alone simply because it looks decorative, without most people realizing it's directly connected to something in nearly every kitchen in the country. Queen Anne's lace is the wild ancestor of the cultivated carrot, and the root, when young, is edible, pale, woody, and carrot-flavored. Though considerably tougher and less sweet than the vegetable, it eventually became through generations of selective cultivation. There's an important safety note that has to come with this one. Queen Anne's lace closely resembles poison hemlock, a genuinely toxic plant that grows in similar conditions, and the two can be difficult to tell apart for anyone without foraging experience. So this is not a plant to harvest casually without confirmed identification from an experienced forager, since the consequences of a misidentification here are serious rather than merely unpleasant. With that caution stated clearly, the flower clusters themselves have a long history of culinary use where properly identified, battered, and fried, or used to infuse a mild, faintly floral flavor into simple syrups and vinegars. The plant also carries a distinct traditional history in folk medicine, where crushed seeds were historically used. Though this application in particular carries enough risk and inconsistency that it's mentioned here strictly as historical context rather than a recommendation. Every carrot sitting in a refrigerator or garden bed traces its lineage directly back to a roadside plant that most people walk past without a second glance, admiring the lace-like flowers without any idea what they're actually looking at. Number 1. Stinging nettle. Serrated, deep green leaves covered in tiny hollow hairs that deliver an immediate, sharp sting on contact. Stinging nettle has one of the worst reputations of any plant on this list. And for good reason, since almost everyone who's brushed against it in shorts has a specific unpleasant memory attached to it. That sting comes from a combination of compounds injected through those hollow hairs the moment they touch skin. And it's exactly why most people give this plant a wide berth rather than a second look. Here's what changes everything. The moment nettle is cooked, dried, or blended, that sting disappears completely, and what's left behind is one of the most nutritionally dense wild greens that exists anywhere. Nettle leaves are exceptionally high in iron, calcium, and vitamin A, along with a surprising amount of protein for a leafy green. And they've been used as a legitimate food source across Europe and Asia for thousands of years, typically wilted into soups, blended into pesto, or steeped into a deep green mineral-rich tea. Traditional herbal medicine has also used nettle for centuries as a remedy for joint pain and mild inflammation. And modern research has continued to examine nettle extract for those same anti-inflammatory properties. A case where folk use and current study have landed on remarkably similar conclusions independently. The fibers inside a mature nettle stem are strong enough that entire textile industries were built around them before cotton became widely available. With nettle fiber cloth showing up in archaeological finds thousands of years old, and nettle fabric production continuing in some regions well into the 20th century. Beekeepers value it too, since nettle flowers, though small and easy to miss, provide a reliable source of pollen during a part of the season when other blooms can be inconsistent. The exact same plant that leaves a stinging welt on bare skin during a careless walk through overgrown grass has clothed people, fed people, and treated their joint pain for longer than most cultivated crops have existed, all while everyone kept their distance and called it nothing but a hazard. 12 plants, and every single one of them was already doing something useful long before anyone decided it needed to go. Some fed early bees when nothing else was blooming. Some clothed people before cotton existed. Some are the direct, unmodified ancestors of vegetables sitting in refrigerators right now. The next time you're out in the yard about to pull one of these, take a closer look first. You might be about to get rid of the one thing that's actually been working in your favor the entire time. If this changed how you'll look at your own yard, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And if there are any video topics you'd like me to cover, let me know down in the comments below. Thanks for watching.